This program is made possible in part by Cerisi Conlon LLP, protecting the future and using the law as a force for good in both the courtroom and our communities. Online at cerisiconlon.com.
Hello and welcome. I'm with Chuck Slocum tonight, and if you've lived in Minnesota for a few or many years, you'll know his name. He is now a management consultant with the Williston Group. He has been, though, an advisor, a counsel for many of our governors. He was the chair of the Republican Party way back in the 70s, Chuck, wow. He's just been involved in so many different ventures, working with 3M.
No, Honeywell and Dayton Hudson Corp.
That's right, those two big ones.
Yeah.
So you've run across his name and interviews, I'm sure, in many places. So it's great to have you join me tonight,
Well,
Chuck.
and I actually work for Channel 6.
Oh, right, I forgot that.
Yeah.
That's important. He was the executive director in the early days, too, at Channel 6, the Metro Cable Network, or now it's called MCN 6. But we're here to talk not about your work right now, but about your personal life. And we're going to talk about something Chuck wrote about recently that got me to pick up the phone and ask him if he wouldn't come down and talk with me about it. And it's a hard topic, the death of his son by suicide. And this happened 25 years ago,
Yes.
almost now. But it's one of those things that can feel as fresh as last week, I'm guessing. So thank you for, being open about this.
Well, and thank you for your willingness to talk about the subject. I know you have in the past. And more of us should be aware that there's a strong link between depression and clinical depression and major depression and suicide. And so we have to be open about that. And there are hopeful signs that if you do the right thing with counseling and with drugs, and you face up the issue of suicide with people that are talking about suicide, and many people do talk about suicide, there is a high incidence of people that are able to cope with it and move on. And it's not something that people go through again and again and again in the main. You generally go into these deep pits of depression that I'm talking about once in your life.
And it's quite common. I mean, I know statistics aren't a big part of this subject, but 1 out of 4 people in our country, I have learned and read, do have to deal with clinical depression at some point in their life. That's a lot of us, and that's why this is a topic that's so universal in a way in its scope. So
much of that we know because people have been open about it and have sought treatment. And that's, again, an issue linked to suicide, but it's an issue that doesn't always lead to life-ending things.
No.
But it certainly has sapped the economic muscle and the human ability of people to get along and to people succeed in life.
If you're depressed and seriously depressed, I remember learning something about depression that I had not heard before, and I'm a social worker, but it was described as almost the worst physical pain as well as the worst emotional pain when you're clinically depressed. And I had somehow missed the physical part. And now I believe that it's true, but your son, let's pull that whole hard story in. He died of suicide when he was 20, am I right, Chuck?
My son, yes. He was 20. And he used the most common method of suicide for men is guns. And in other parts of the world, hanging is a technique people use, particularly men, to kill themselves, to end their own lives.
And it's more
Women, on the
common
other
that
hand,
men
sometimes take drugs that are able to put them to sleep, and that is more common among women.
a less
They're
violent
less,
kind of.
they're less violent about it, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great resistance on the part of men to acknowledge and get therapy from a psychologist.
Yes.
I remember when my son was struggling so much in about his sophomore year.
In high school.
In high school, sophomore year in high school, and he was skipping school. So much so, but he was telling his friends in his network that he was going to the art school that Governor Perpich had set up. He had met Governor Perpich, and he was kind of interested in that, but he was literally moribund, and I was dealing with him, but I was working as well, and he eventually worked his way through that, acknowledged it openly, told his friends that no, he wasn't at the art school, and he went back to Hopkins High School and finished in the top 10% of his class.
Wow.
So he'd been a good student, but then he'd been a dropout student, and then he came back.
So that dropout period was unusual for him in terms of his.
Well, he'd been a very good student, and he had gone to school, and he was in a pretty good school system. I'm not saying he was walking on water, but he certainly ended well in his class.
Right, to get
Well, I think it was like
up in the
1,000
top
kids, and he's in the
10.
top 100. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. What was he like as a little boy? Did you see any signs of
No, I didn't
emotional
see. He was
struggle?
He was very curious. He had a good sense of humor. He seemed to have lots of friends. And we had a cabin up north, and I remember once taking Judd and his Cub Scout troop up to my cabin in February, and thinking, well, there's a lot of ice out there. We'll walk over. We won't go up the hills. We'll walk over the ice. And of course, to me, the ice was up to my knees, but to them, it was up to their armpits.
Yeah.
And we came up to my cabin eventually and warmed that fire, and I couldn't get him to go out and do much after that. But we did have a good weekend, and he liked being around his friends, and he had his friends. We had
That
three of
sounds
his
like a
closest
normal
friends
boy.
speak. We had insight into him so nicely at his funeral at Faith Presbyterian Church. Libby and a girlfriend that he knew. I don't think it was a dating deal. And then Paul and Ben were his close friends, and they all came to speak at his funeral. And that was moving. They were his age,
Yeah,
and
I bet.
they told their stories.
In the editorial that was in the paper, you just briefly mentioned that 700 people showed up for his funeral.
It was the most people at that point, the most people we'd ever had in that church, right on the border between Hopkins and Minnetonka.
What kind of things, and I'm thinking this might be one of them, but what kind of things that happened with friends and family helped you, Chuck, and your wife at the time get through this shocking end to Judd's life?
Well, I think very few people realize that a suicide survivor, by the way, is not someone who's attempted suicide and survived it. A suicide survivor is one of that very small group of people, 6 to 8 usually in a person's life, that are survivors, and they're also a consideration as we move ahead. And I had people willing to listen to me, and I had people willing to understand why I could or could not deal with it. But people reached out and showed me that they knew that we had a special relationship, and that the loss was huge for me.
They knew that you and Judd had a special,
yes, that's what I mean.
Because he lived with you.
Yes, he
as a
did.
single
Even after
parent, right?
his mom and I divorced, and he lived with me, and I was trying to hold down jobs too. So it was an interesting challenge. But I also was the boss in these jobs, so I could control my hours
had
pretty well,
yeah,
more than most.
Some flexibility.
Yeah.
As a little boy, he sounds like everything was just so normal. What about as a teenager? That's when he had the skipping school. Were there other things that happened in retrospect that you look back and
Well,
say,
I'm a guy that I was an athlete, and he wanted to be an athlete, but when he didn't win in track, for example, he was pretty fast, and the coach said, geez, stick with me. But he went to a meet and competed, and then another meet and competed, and because he didn't win or didn't feel he did well, he didn't want to do that anymore, and that was kind of contrary to my thinking. But
he was a perfectionist, probably then.
Yeah, he wanted to do well at what he did, and he didn't like not doing as well as he set pretty high standards for himself.
But you maybe set a high standard too, because I read, am I remembering this right, Chuck, that you were in the Olympic trials as a wrestler, right?
Yes, I wanted him. I thought he would have been a great wrestler, but because Dad was a wrestler, that wasn't going to be a choice for him.
But that maybe also made him think that, oh gosh, I've really got to put the effort in here.
I don't think he perceived. I mean, he didn't watch the Olympics on TV, or he didn't.
Okay, so he didn't take that as
I don't think that was a big issue for us. But yeah, he wasn't going to be his dad. He was going to be himself.
His own self.
And he had a self-image of who that should be, and things got to be too much for him. And all of us, those 6 or 8 people, of course, I can name them, that were around him.
So you're saying that
All of us.
suicide survivors are the people who probably loved him and cared
Yes.
the most?
Yes.
Okay.
Those people did not have a good explanation any more than his mother or I did.
No.
That, oh, we saw this coming, blah, blah, blah. No. And that's pretty typical,
I know.
Mary. That's pretty
I
typical.
know that is. But I bet it is tempting or sort of seductive to look back and see, oh, did we miss something? Or, you know.
we brought him to a psychologist who's, when he met with us and we were explaining about Judd, we said we're concerned about him and his engagement with school, and he seems to be depressed, and it was hard for me to get him to go to see this psychologist. And he confided with me that, well, he had a special insight into suicide because his sister had committed suicide. But, well, that was probably a strength.
This is the counselor talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, therapist.
And we agreed that he would go as long as necessary, and he went for 3 sessions, and then the doc wanted him to sign up for more, and he refused. And that brought me back into it. And then the doctor said, no, if he's so vehemently opposed, I don't want to waste my time either. Which is the therapists have to do their work, and they have to professional life to continue. So the depressed people that may need the help the most, sometimes by their own actions, discourage professionals from helping them.
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably quite common, We're already halfway through our wonderful 28 minutes here, but I want to ask, in terms of resources and things that people can do to be supportive after someone
After a
that they
suicide?
love has experienced a suicide?
Well, there's a group. That I think was formed about the time of Judd's death, maybe a couple of years before, called SAVE, S-A-V-E, Suicide Awareness Voices of Education.
And they're still around, aren't
They're
they?
still around. I just checked today their website, and they have people with an interest and an ability. The man we hired to run it years ago is still running it. He has a doctorate degree. He doesn't have any personal interaction with suicide, which is unusual for someone in a job like that.
Yeah.
But they have very healthy recommendations and regular forums where people can go that are, and that's how I heard about it, that have lost someone, and to learn how to deal with it and how to help others. And I would cite that as a place to make a connection with if someone is concerned about how they can move ahead constructively and be helpful. But the key thing is for an individual is to acknowledge the depression and to be open to working on it. And the results are very good if people do that, but half the people won't acknowledge it. And there's a high percentage of people that do, 50%, and they 90% of those people come through it and return to their normal life.
That's the good news, I think, in this hard topic, that depression is treatable. And
Yes.
it often, though, is hard, I think, because if you are put on a med, there is a lag of about 3 weeks, right?
It depends on the med, I think. Yeah.
Right, but some of the more common ones,
Yeah, you don't pop right back.
you don't have a result very, immediately.
And you've got to have the conversations, and you've got to work on those conversations.
And you've got to be somewhat patient, which is hard to be when you're feeling terrible.
When you're feeling so low.
Yeah, really hard to be.
That's how many people that are depressed turn to drugs or alcohol, which is also a drug. And that gives them some sort of temporary relief, but it doesn't solve the problem.
It kind of masks the problem, doesn't
It
it?
can mask it, and it can also create even more problems.
Yeah, you're more vulnerable than if you're using heavily in terms of decision making. And there's NAMI. Did you ever plug into NAMI?
Yes.
Sue
I did.
Abder Holden is, I think, the longest running director of a support group like NAMI in the country, and has done some great things. And they've got support groups, as does
Yes.
SAVE. So we've got some great resources here. And what do you think, Chuck, about the new phone number that we're told?
Yes, I haven't
can
called
call.
that number, but there is a suicide crisis line that we can call. It's like going 411 only. Do you remember?
988.
988.
Yeah.
The 988 number that you can call, and you can get somebody really informed on depression and suicide right away talking to you. And they're going to ask questions, and they're going to probe and try to come up with a way to proceed in that first 30-minute discussion.
We had another national hotline number, but this sounds better. 988. We can remember that better than
Yeah,
the
it used to be
former
just a regular
letter.
phone number.
It
yeah.
was,
Yeah.
and it was,
Who's going to
what?
find it?
Yes, 8 digits, and oh boy. But I believe this one is also, as the first one was, 24/7. So that's important. Middle of the night kind of
Yeah.
need, you've got someone to talk to. So
Yeah.
that's important to know. You made a point earlier, and I want to double back to that because I think people may really be thinking, did I hear him right? You said that if you've attempted suicide, you probably are not going to continue attempting if it didn't work.
If if you could attempted suicide and survive, many people work through that in such a way that they've learned enough about themselves and how to take care of themselves mentally as well as physically, that they don't go back to that place. I remember hearing, well, you know, and they well-meant people, well, you know, if he hadn't done it now, he'd have done it in 6 months. And there were people that knew nothing about suicide, as I knew nothing about suicide.
Yeah.
I didn't sit there and say yes, or it didn't seem right to me. And now I've been able to spend enough time to validate that a single attempt at suicide or deep, deep depression that may cause you to want to die is not necessarily a sign that that's what you'll live with forever.
And that's important too,
yes,
to realize.
I think that's helpful. I've known a lot of people that have come up to me because I've been pretty open and told me, well, I was almost there. And here's what happened to me. So people deserve to live the best life that they can. And the tragedy for me is that my son Judson had a good life and he had great potential, and that he got so desperate that he killed himself rather than face the day. He went off to Purdue after he graduated from Hopkins, and then he just quit at Purdue.
Right, I read that.
And the weekend before he died in February, he was out with some buddies from St. Thomas, and he went to a concert, and he stiffed me for a meal that I had planned with the family. But that was the weekend, and then it was on a Wednesday night. I'd been out in Washington, and he'd called me, so I'd called him back, and I was concerned about him, and so I got back quicker than I normally would have, and I found him when I came to see him. And he'd taken a gun, and he'd put the gun under his chin, and he'd tied the trigger to his toe, and he stomped his foot down, and it's something you can learn to do online.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, I didn't know that.
At the time, yeah.
That's one of the common ways to...
Chuck, if someone says to you, what do you say to a loved one or a friend that you are close to and love, if they say, I'm thinking of suicide? There are some guidelines.
Well, the first thing I do is say, can you talk to me a little more about that?
So get them to talk.
You know that that's kind of unusual, and can you talk to me about that? And things will come out if you're earnest about it and the person is open. If they're open enough to tell you that, they're probably open enough to tell you why.
So you don't want to say, oh, you can't be thinking about that.
Yeah. Shut up about that.
Right.
Yeah, no, that won't help.
But I think a lot of people are so shocked if they hear that statement and so horrified that they don't want to hear about it themselves, right?
Well, the percentage of people that are deeply depressed and think about killing themselves is far higher than the percentage of people that attempt suicide. And we have a natural inclination to want to live our lives.
Right,
And
that's a
when
strong...
it's so desperate, if someone is willing to listen, it's really helpful. And then if someone's willing to see a professional and take appropriate meds that will help get through this valley, then you're on your way. A lot of people have been able to do that.
If someone does, open up and is willing to talk, one of the things I've heard, and I want to see if you think this works, is to ask them, how serious are you, and have you thought about how you would want to do this?
I would let them, I don't know if that would be my question.
Well, it's a hard question to ask.
That way you get them into dealing with doing suicide, and they probably hadn't thought all that through. Maybe they had. But I think you want to get them, the why question is bigger than the how.
That's interesting. I think the angle that I've heard some people talk about is that if you have someone who is able to tell you how, that means you really have a vulnerable person.
Well, people have
So-
thought about it whether they tell you or not.
Well, that's a good point too.
And women take drugs, men hang themselves, or men shoot themselves. I mean, that's generally what happens. We know that. America's suicide rate looks to be climbing a bit, but it's not because I think we have many more people trying to kill themselves as it is because people like you have brought this to the attention of folks, and
we're more open about it.
we're more open about it. We're more willing to talk about it. We're more willing to, as you and I were talking about. I put in my son's obit. I told the
Yes.
story that he had killed himself by his own hand, and
Which back in 1997 was
yeah, and that was unusual.
unusual. Yeah.
You see occasionally, like you did recently, that people that work around suicide will talk about that. Go ahead.
Well, we are out of time, Chuck. We could talk a long, long time about this
Well, thank you
huge
for having me.
topic. Well, thank you. Thank you for, again, being open and honest and giving us hope, too, that there is treatment available, that it works, and that you survived. I mean, you didn't go off and, become a recluse after this happened.
Yeah, I should have acknowledged that there is a family connection. If someone in a family commits suicide, that a sibling or a parent sometimes does
It's
as
almost
well.
like it's more.
So it's a broader thing than just one person.
Yeah.
And so we have to be aware of that, and part of our that's why we need professionals helping us.
Yeah, we need to reach out. Well, thanks again. It's been
Thank you.
great seeing you again and working
Good luck
with
with
you.
the Mary Hanson show.
Thank you. I have been talking with Chuck Slocum, and as you know from the beginning, if you were here from the beginning, he is a management consultant, a real leader in Minnesota, and the loving father of Judson, who died by suicide. I hope you will look up some of the resources. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week.